The moment you realize that everything you hold dear is impermanent is the moment you truly begin to live. This powerful teaching of the Buddha invites us to look at life and death not as opposing forces, but as part of an inseparable, eternal cycle. Many of us often think of life and death as two separate, conflicting events: life, full of opportunities and experiences, and death, something we tend to fear and avoid. But in the teachings of the Buddha, these are not two opposing concepts. Life and death are simply two aspects of the same continuous process. The cycle of samsara, the wheel of birth, death, and rebirth. From a Buddhist perspective, death is not an end, but a transition. It is simply a part of the impermanent nature of existence. And life, too, is impermanent, fleeting, and ever-changing. Everything we experience, from joy to suffering, from birth to death, is momentary. Understanding this is not a cause for despair, but rather an invitation to live more fully, with greater wisdom and mindfulness. Why is this understanding of life and death so crucial in Buddhism? Because how we view these two phenomena deeply influences how we live our lives. If we cling to life or fear death, we find ourselves trapped in suffering. But if we can accept the impermanence of both, we release ourselves from fear and attachment, and open ourselves to the possibility of true peace and liberation. In today's podcast, we are going to delve into the Buddha's teachings on the cycle of samsara, birth, death, and rebirth, and explore how this understanding can guide us not only in understanding the nature of existence after death, but also in living more meaningfully in the present moment. By understanding that both life and death are part of the same cycle, we can approach each with greater wisdom, compassion, and freedom. We'll explore the deep connection between life and death in Buddhist philosophy, and how, by accepting the impermanence of all things, we can live with more peace, more clarity, and ultimately, more happiness. Stay with us as we journey through the Buddha's timeless wisdom on life and death. You'll learn not only what the Buddha taught about the afterlife, but also how these teachings can help you live more fully in the present, free from the fear of death and the attachments that bind us to suffering. 1. The truth about life and death in Buddhism. Everything that has a beginning has an end, but it is in the spaces between that we find our true essence. These words echo the profound wisdom that pervades Buddhist teachings. In Buddhism, the truth about life and death is rooted in the concept of impermanence, or anicca, the first of the three marks of existence. Everything around us, whether it's the joy we experience, the relationships we cherish, or even the very life we live, is impermanent. Nothing remains constant. Everything is in a constant state of flux. This includes the phenomena of life and death. Both are, in essence, temporary and interconnected parts of the same cycle of existence. Buddhism teaches that life is fleeting and death is inevitable, but this is not something to fear. Instead, it is something to embrace with mindfulness and understanding. Why? Because it is in understanding impermanence that we begin to see the truth about suffering and the path to liberation. The Four Noble Truths of Buddhism begin with the recognition that suffering, or dukkha, is an inherent part of life. Suffering arises because we are attached to things that are impermanent, whether it's our bodies, our desires, or our relationships. When things inevitably change or come to an end, we experience pain, loss, and sorrow. This suffering is not just about the physical aspects of life and death, but the mental and emotional attachments we have to them. Death, in particular, brings a stark reminder of the impermanence of life. But Buddhism offers a different perspective on death. It teaches us that death is not an end but a transformation, a transition to another phase in the cycle of samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The fear of death arises from ignorance, from not understanding the true nature of existence. When we come to understand that death is just a part of a continuous cycle, we can let go of this fear. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from attachment to life, attachment to the idea of permanence, and attachment to the self. But when we realize the truth of impermanence and stop clinging to things, we can find freedom. This freedom is not found by avoiding death, but by understanding it, by embracing the idea that it is as natural as birth, and that it is not to be feared but understood and accepted with mindfulness. So, what is the way out of suffering in the face of life and death? It is through the right understanding, a deep, penetrating awareness that everything is temporary, that both life and death are part of the same process, and that we are not separate from this cycle. The Buddha taught that by cultivating wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline, we can free ourselves from the cycle of suffering. This is the essence of nirvana, the ultimate freedom from suffering, which is not an escape from life and death, but an awakening to the nature of all existence. As we begin to grasp the nature of life and death through the lens of impermanence and suffering, we uncover a deeper wisdom, one that frees us from fear and attachment. In the next part of this podcast, we'll explore how this understanding can guide us toward liberation and how the Buddha's teachings on mindfulness can transform our experience of both life and death, revealing a path to true peace. 2. Vong Luan Hoi Vat Sai Chet. In Buddhism, life and death are not separate events. They are two sides of the same coin, connected in a seamless cycle known as samsara. The word samsara means wandering or cycling, and it describes the ongoing cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth. This cycle is not something that happens once in a lifetime, but something that continuously affects all beings. Bound by the laws of karma and impermanence, death, in Buddhist philosophy, is not seen as the final end, but rather as a transition, a change in form, like the shedding of a skin. Just as a seed sprouts into a tree, the cycle of life moves forward, impermanent yet eternal. In the Buddha's teachings, we are invited to view death not as a fearful event to be avoided or resisted, but as a natural part of the fabric of existence. Much like life itself, the Buddha taught that the fear of death arises from the ignorance of the impermanent nature of life. We cling to things, relationships, and identities because we are attached to the idea of permanence. We see ourselves as separate from the world around us and fear death because it challenges this illusion of separateness and permanence. This attachment to the self, or atta, is the root cause of suffering. When we understand that everything, our bodies, our relationships, our possessions, is impermanent, we can begin to face death with a sense of peace and clarity. However, this doesn't mean we should approach death with indifference. In Buddhism, death is not something to be treated lightly or passively. Rather, it is a crucial moment in our spiritual journey, a moment when we can test how deeply we have cultivated mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom in our lives. By contemplating death, we awaken to the present moment and the preciousness of each breath we take. We are reminded that life is fragile and that the time to practice is now, not later. One of the most famous stories that highlights the Buddha's teachings on death and impermanence involves a woman named Kisagatami. She had a son, a young child who died suddenly, and she was devastated by the loss. In her grief, she went to the Buddha for help, asking if he could bring her son back to life. The Buddha, seeing her sorrow, told her to go and collect mustard seeds from every household in the village, seeds from households that had never experienced the death of a loved one. Kisagatami eagerly set off to find these seeds, believing that she would bring them back to the Buddha and her son would be revived. But as she went from house to house, she discovered that every household, without exception, had experienced death in some form, whether it was the death of a child, a parent, or a loved one. Kisagatami realized that death is universal. It touches every life. She returned to the Buddha, no longer seeking a miraculous solution, but instead asking for wisdom. The Buddha explained to her that death is a part of the natural order of life, and that clinging to the illusion of permanence only leads to suffering. This profound realization shifted Kisagatami's grief into acceptance and understanding. This story serves as a powerful reminder that death is not something that happens to others, but is a universal truth that we all must face. The Buddha's wisdom teaches us to face this truth not with fear, but with understanding and compassion. Living in the face of death, mindfulness, and acceptance. The Buddha's teachings on death are not simply theoretical, they are deeply practical. meant to be lived and embodied in our daily experience. Mindfulness, or sati, plays a central role in how we relate to the reality of death. By practicing mindfulness, we learn to be present with the moment as it is, without clinging or resisting. We stop trying to deny the impermanence of life and instead embrace it as part of our spiritual practice. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the foundations of mindfulness, the Buddha teaches us to contemplate the body, feelings, mind, and dhammas, mental objects, as they truly are, impermanent, unsatisfactory, and not self. This practice of mindfulness, when applied to the contemplation of death, allows us to break free from the grasping mind that seeks to hold on to life, avoiding death at all costs. When we confront death through mindfulness, we begin to see it in a different light. We understand that death is not a separate event that happens to us in isolation. Rather, it is part of the larger cycle of samsara, the endless wheel of birth, death, and rebirth. This awareness doesn't lead to fear or paralysis, but to freedom. When we accept the inevitability of death, we also accept that we are not in control of life and death. This acceptance releases us from the constant anxiety and fear that often accompanies the idea of death. The practice of mindfulness allows us to engage fully with life, knowing that it is fleeting. In the face of death, we are challenged to live more authentically, to prioritize what truly matters. This shift in perspective brings a deep sense of peace, because we understand that death is not something to fear, but something to be acknowledged as a natural part of the cycle of existence. The 4 reminders, preparing for death. In Tibetan Buddhism, there are 4 reminders that are often recited as part of the daily practice. These reminders serve as a reflection on the reality of life, death, and impermanence. 1. The impermanence of all things. Everything in the world, from our bodies to our possessions, is subject to change and decay. We are born, we grow old, and we die. 2. The inevitability of death. No matter how much wealth, power, or prestige we acquire, death is certain for all living beings. 3. The nature of the mind. We must recognize that the mind is the source of our suffering, and it is through our attachment to our desires and fears that we remain trapped in the cycle of rebirth. 4. The need to practice now. Since death is uncertain and we never know when it will come, it is essential to practice diligently in the present moment, developing virtues such as compassion, wisdom, and mindfulness. These 4 reminders are not meant to induce despair, but to help us cultivate a sense of urgency in our practice. The understanding of death is not morbid but liberating. By recognizing that death is inevitable and that life is precious, we are encouraged to live fully, cultivating qualities that will help us transcend the cycle of samsara and achieve liberation. The cycle of samsara and the role of mindfulness. The cycle of samsara is not something we can escape by simply avoiding death. Rather, it is through our understanding and acceptance of the impermanence of life that we can begin to break free. The more we practice mindfulness, the more we align ourselves with the true nature of existence, where life and death are seen as natural processes, neither to be clung to nor feared. In fact, it is through mindfulness that we can transcend the cycle of rebirth. As the Buddha taught, the cycle of samsara continues because of our attachments and ignorance. When we face death with clarity and mindfulness, we free ourselves from the bonds of fear, attachment, and craving. Death, then, becomes an opportunity for liberation rather than a source of suffering. The Buddha's final words, a call to freedom. At the end of his life, as he lay on his deathbed, the Buddha gave his final teachings to his disciples. His last words were, "Be a lamp unto yourselves. Be a refuge to yourselves. Seek for no other refuge." These words encapsulate the essence of the Buddha's teachings on life and death. The Buddha did not offer a magic solution to the problem of death. Instead, he urged his followers to cultivate wisdom, mindfulness, and self-reliance. By understanding the nature of death and life, we are able to transcend our fears and attachments and live with a deep sense of peace and clarity. Death is not something to fear or resist. It is part of the natural flow of life, and by understanding its impermanent nature, we can transcend the suffering that it brings. Through mindfulness and the wisdom of the Buddha, we can navigate the inevitable reality of death with peace, compassion, and understanding, freeing ourselves from the cycle of samsara and embracing liberation. 3. The value of accepting death. In Buddhism, death is not something to be feared or avoided. In fact, the Buddha teaches us that facing and accepting death as an inevitable part of life is a crucial step on the path to spiritual development. Death, in the light of Buddhist teachings, is not seen as the absolute end but as part of an ongoing process, an integral part of the cycle of samsara. Therefore, instead of running away from death or denying it, we are encouraged to face it with mindfulness, awareness, and understanding. In our daily lives, we often seek to avoid death at all costs. We cling to relationships, wealth, and status as a means of resisting the impermanence of life. Yet, death is inevitable. One of the key lessons the Buddha imparts is that understanding the impermanent nature of life and embracing death as part of the natural flow of things can free us from the fear and suffering that comes from resisting it. The Buddha teaches us that when we face death with understanding, we are freed from attachment to the self, atta, our constant cravings and fears around death, and the attachment to what we hold dear, cause suffering. However, when we stop resisting the idea of death and instead accept it as a natural part of life, we are liberated from that suffering, rather than being a source of fear. Death becomes a teacher, reminding us to live each moment with intention, mindfulness, and love, living with awareness of death, a more meaningful life. Accepting death doesn't only help us overcome our fear of it, it also enhances the quality of our lives. When we become aware of death certainty, we begin to live more mindfully, more deliberately. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha famously said, "Live each day as if it were your last." This doesn't mean living in fear or anxiety about death, but rather recognizing that each moment is precious, and that we should not take our time for granted. When we become aware that death could come at any time, we are more likely to focus on what truly matters: love, compassion, wisdom, and selflessness. The awareness of death makes each moment more valuable. When we realize that life is short and uncertain, we begin to live with more urgency and clarity. We stop wasting time on trivial pursuits and start focusing on deeper, more meaningful aspects of life, building relationships, growing spiritually, and contributing to the world around us. The awareness of death is not meant to make us fearful, but to help us live fully in the present moment. To further illustrate the value of accepting death, we can look to the story of Khema, a renowned Buddhist nun and former queen. Before becoming a disciple of the Buddha, Khema had been a queen, enjoying immense wealth and luxury. However, upon hearing the Buddha's teachings on impermanence, suffering, and death, she realized that her attachment to material wealth and the fear of death were the root causes of her suffering. One day, while in the presence of the Buddha, Khema asked, "Master, is it possible to live forever?" The Buddha responded, "Death is inevitable. It is not something to be feared, but something to be understood. When you truly accept death as part of life, you will live a life of wisdom, free from fear." This simple yet profound teaching opened Khema's eyes. She stopped fearing death and instead began to live a life of peace, clarity, and purpose. In time, she became one of the most accomplished and enlightened nuns in the Buddha's community. Khema's story teaches us that when we stop fearing death and begin to understand it as a natural part of existence, we gain freedom from suffering. Death becomes less of a fear and more of a teacher, urging us to live with clarity and purpose. It reminds us that our time here is limited, and we must make the most of every moment. Accepting death does not mean living in constant fear of it. Rather, it means living with the understanding that life is fleeting. When we acknowledge the inevitability of death, we are encouraged to live each moment with mindfulness and gratitude. This awareness allows us to live with purpose, focusing on what truly matters. One of the great benefits of accepting death is that it helps us stop clinging to things that ultimately don't bring us lasting peace or happiness. Our desire for wealth, fame, and success often distracts us from the more meaningful aspects of life: love, compassion, and inner peace. But when we understand that death is coming for all of us, we begin to prioritize what is truly important: relationships, spiritual growth, and contributing to the greater good. In a world where we are often caught up in the hustle and bustle of daily life, accepting death can help us reconnect with the true essence of our existence. It can remind us to live with a sense of purpose, to love freely, and to embrace each moment fully. We stop wasting time on trivial concerns and begin to live with a greater sense of clarity and meaning. Facing death is not easy, but it is an essential part of the Buddhist path. When we live with the awareness that death is inevitable, we begin to live more meaningfully and with greater intention. The Buddha taught that understanding death is key to understanding life, and only by accepting death can we live in a way that brings true peace and liberation. Death, in this sense, is not something to fear but something to embrace. It is our greatest teacher, showing us the impermanence of all things, and encouraging us to live with mindfulness and love in the present moment. By accepting death as a natural part of life, we are not just preparing for the inevitable, but also transforming our relationship with the here and now. We begin to live with more purpose, more compassion, and more wisdom, knowing that every moment is precious. 4. Death as an opportunity for practice and transformation. In Buddhism, death is not seen as a final, fearful end, but as an essential part of the ongoing cycle of samsara, a part that, with the right understanding, offers an opportunity for profound spiritual practice and transformation. The Buddhist teachings encourage us to use the awareness of our mortality as a tool for spiritual growth, enabling us to break free from attachment and delusion. Through mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom, we can transform our relationship with death and turn it into a catalyst for liberation. The Buddha often spoke of death in a way that might seem counterintuitive to many, as an opportunity for spiritual practice rather than a time for fear or sorrow. In the Dhammapada, he says, "All conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering." Recognizing the impermanence of life and the inevitability of death is one of the deepest insights that Buddhism offers. But this knowledge does not serve to make us fearful. Instead, it is a reminder to live with urgency, to live mindfully, and to live with awareness of the present moment. In the same way that the awareness of death can make us live more meaningfully, it also helps us practice letting go. In Buddhism, one of the most fundamental practices is the cultivation of non-attachment. Death forces us to confront our attachments to material possessions, relationships, and even to our own identity. When we recognize that everything, including ourselves, is impermanent, we learn to let go of our attachments. This letting go is not a form of denial but an opening to freedom, wisdom, and peace. One of the core Buddhist teachings is that all things are impermanent, and death is the ultimate manifestation of this truth. The Buddha teaches that the awareness of impermanence is crucial for our liberation. When we recognize the impermanence of life, we are not meant to fear it, but to use it as a stepping stone for spiritual awakening. In the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha shares his final words with his disciples. "Behold now, monks, I exhort you. All compounded things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence." These words remind us that everything, including our own bodies, will eventually perish. But rather than being an invitation to despair, these words challenge us to embrace our impermanence, to make the most of the time we have, and to deepen our practice in preparation for death. By reflecting on our mortality, we are encouraged to practice mindfulness and concentration, two of the most essential tools for Buddhist meditation. When we meditate on death, not in a morbid sense, but as a means to cultivate awareness, we learn to live more fully. We learn to value each breath, each moment, and each interaction as an opportunity to cultivate wisdom, compassion, and equanimity. The practice of meditation plays a central role in transforming our relationship with death. In the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha gives detailed instructions on mindfulness, including mindfulness of death. By reflecting on the certainty of death, practitioners can cultivate a deep sense of impermanence, which in turn helps them free themselves from attachment and fear. The practice of Maranasati, mindfulness of death, involves contemplating the inevitability of death. When practiced properly, it doesn't lead to despair but to a deepening of one's spiritual commitment. It helps us realize the preciousness of each moment and inspires us to make our lives more meaningful. It also encourages us to live without attachment, knowing that all things, including our bodies and loved ones, are temporary. This mindfulness practice encourages us to reflect on the various aspects of death, the death of others, the death of our own desires, and even the death of our old selves. By contemplating these aspects, we are reminded of the preciousness of our lives and the importance of living with purpose. One of the most transformative aspects of the Buddha's teachings on death is that they allow us to transcend the fear of death. The fear of death, as the Buddha teaches, arises from attachment to the body, to possessions, to status, and to self-identity. When we recognize that these attachments are impermanent and transient, the fear of losing them diminishes. In the Salatha Sutta, the Buddha says that death is like a dart, a painful experience that pierces the heart. However, the second dart, the dart of fear, anger, and attachment, is self-inflicted. When we face death without fear, without attachment, we are no longer wounded by the second dart. Instead, we are able to approach death with peace, understanding, and acceptance. This understanding of death, free from fear and attachment, is a source of deep spiritual strength. It is a form of liberation from the fear of losing what we cannot keep. It is also the key to breaking the cycle of samsara, or the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth that binds us to suffering. Death, in Buddhist teachings, is not something that merely happens to us at the end of our lives. It is a constant presence, a reminder of the impermanence of all things. Embracing the reality of death as a part of life opens the door to deeper spiritual growth. It reminds us to practice diligently, to live mindfully, and to cherish every moment. The Buddha taught that our final liberation comes not through avoiding death, but through facing it with understanding, wisdom, and compassion. By accepting death as a natural part of the human experience, we come to understand that life itself is precious. We learn to live with greater awareness, to cultivate compassion for ourselves and others, and to break free from the cycles of fear, attachment, and suffering. Death, as taught by the Buddha, is not an end but a gateway. It is a gateway to deeper understanding, to the cessation of suffering, and to the realization of our true nature. By using the awareness of death as an opportunity to practice mindfulness, we not only prepare ourselves for the inevitable, but we also transform our lives in the process. Death becomes not a source of fear, but a catalyst for awakening, helping us to live with greater clarity, compassion, and wisdom. The key is to use the awareness of death to live fully in the present, to embrace life, as well as death, with a sense of mindfulness, purpose, and love. In doing so, we walk the path to liberation, where death no longer has power over us, but where we are free to live with peace and grace. 5. Applying Buddhist wisdom to life. In the face of death, many of us might naturally feel a sense of fear or anxiety. The unknown, the end of our existence, and the impermanence of life can stir up deep emotions. However, Buddhism offers a radically different perspective. Instead of seeing death as something to fear or avoid, it invites us to view death as an integral part of life, a natural transition in the cyclical journey of existence. By integrating Buddhist wisdom into our daily lives, we can live more fully, more peacefully, and with a greater sense of self-awareness, knowing that both life and death are part of the same continuum. Living with awareness of impermanence. Buddhist teachings encourage us to embrace the impermanence of all things, including our own lives. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha reminds us, the world is constantly changing. We cannot escape death, for it is inevitable. This recognition of impermanence is not meant to bring sadness or fear, but to awaken us to the preciousness of each moment. When we acknowledge that everything, including our own lives, is fleeting, we are motivated to live more intentionally, making the most of the time we have. In practical terms, applying this understanding to daily life means living with greater mindfulness and presence. Instead of being distracted by the worries of the future or the regrets of the past, we can focus on the here and now. When we live in the present, we experience life more fully, cultivating gratitude for what we have, and more peace in the face of life's challenges, knowing they too are temporary. Mindfulness, a core aspect of Buddhist practice, is an invaluable tool in overcoming our fear of death. Mindfulness teaches us to be fully present in each moment, to observe our thoughts and emotions without judgment. By practicing mindfulness, we can train our minds to accept the natural flow of life, including its inevitable end, with calmness and understanding. The practice of vipassana meditation, for example, encourages us to observe the arising and passing away of thoughts, sensations, and experiences in the body. By becoming more attuned to the transitory nature of all things, we develop a deeper appreciation for life and its impermanence. This awareness allows us to face death not as a threat, but as a natural transition, as part of the cycle of life that we all share. One of the most transformative practices in this regard is Maranasati, or mindfulness of death. This meditation involves reflecting on death not in a morbid or fearful way, but with the understanding that death is simply another natural phenomenon. By meditating on death, we come to terms with its inevitability and begin to let go of our fear of it. This acceptance, in turn, helps us live more fully, free from the anxiety that death often brings. The wisdom of non-attachment. One of the most important teachings of Buddhism regarding life and death is the concept of non-attachment. In the Uddhava Gita, a text attributed to the Buddha, he teaches that attachment to the body, possessions, and even our identities causes suffering. Our fear of death often stems from our attachment to these things, our desire to hold on to what is fleeting. The more we cling to the illusion of permanence, the greater our fear when that permanence is shattered. Non-attachment does not mean indifference or detachment from life. On the contrary, it encourages us to engage with life fully, but without being overwhelmed by it. We can love and care deeply for those around us, but without clinging to them. We can enjoy the pleasures of the world, but without letting them define us. By practicing non-attachment, we learn to accept both life and death with equanimity, understanding that nothing in this world lasts forever. In practical terms, non-attachment can be applied by recognizing the impermanence of relationships, material possessions, and even our own bodies. By letting go of the need to possess or control, we free ourselves from the fear of losing. This liberation allows us to live more authentically and peacefully, knowing that we are not defined by external circumstances, living a life of purpose. When we see death as a natural part of life, we are encouraged to live with greater purpose. The Buddhist teachings on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path provide us with a clear framework for living a life of integrity, kindness, and wisdom. By following the path of right understanding, right speech, right action, and right mindfulness, we create a life that is meaningful, regardless of how long we live. When we understand that life is finite, we are motivated to live with intention. We seek to cultivate qualities such as compassion, wisdom, and generosity, knowing that these actions not only benefit others, but also contribute to our own peace of mind. A life lived with mindfulness and intention is one that is free from regret, because we know we are living in alignment with our highest values. For instance, if we know that our time is limited, we might prioritize our relationships, spending more time with loved ones or offering help to those in need. We might dedicate ourselves more fully to spiritual practices, knowing that these are the things that bring lasting peace and happiness. In this way, an awareness of death can be a powerful motivator for living a meaningful life. When we accept death as a natural and integral part of the human experience, we can cultivate an attitude of gratitude for the gift of life. The Buddhist teachings invite us to embrace both life and death with openness, to see them not as opposing forces, but as two sides of the same coin. Living with the awareness of death also means being present with the inevitable losses we experience throughout our lives. Whether it's the loss of a loved one, the loss of health, or the loss of a job, we can approach these challenges with the understanding that all things are impermanent. By accepting the transient nature of life, we are better able to navigate these losses with grace, knowing that they are simply part of the natural flow of existence. Through mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom, we learn to embrace death as an integral part of life. We realize that by living mindfully, we can find peace even in the face of impermanence. We can live fully in the present, with a deep sense of gratitude, knowing that the precious moments we have now are all we truly possess. As we apply Buddhist wisdom to our daily lives, we come to understand that death is not something to fear, but something to embrace as part of our shared human experience. By living with mindfulness, practicing non-attachment, and cultivating compassion, we can transform our relationship with both life and death. We can live fully and authentically, free from fear and regret, knowing that both life and death are essential parts of the same journey. Ultimately, the key to living fully is to live with awareness of both life and death, to be present in each moment, to cherish each breath, and to cultivate a deep sense of gratitude for the preciousness of life. In doing so, we unlock the possibility for greater peace, clarity, and freedom, allowing us to live with wisdom and grace, no matter when our time comes. As we wrap up today's discussion, we've explored the profound Buddhist teachings on life and death, delving into how the understanding of both can illuminate our path to wisdom and inner peace. In Buddhism, the cycle of life, death, and rebirth is not something to be feared, but something to be understood deeply. The Buddhist teachings remind us that death is not an end, but a natural part of the continuous cycle of existence. By accepting the impermanence of all things, we free ourselves from the anxiety and fear that often accompany the thought of death. Through our exploration, we've seen that life's transience is actually an invitation to live more fully in the present moment, to engage in mindful awareness, and to practice compassion toward ourselves and others, rather than viewing death as a dark finality. We can see it as an integral part of life that gives us the chance to grow, to practice letting go, and to ultimately transcend the suffering that often accompanies attachment. By embracing the Buddhist teachings on life and death, we can live more meaningfully, understanding that every moment is a precious opportunity for spiritual practice. We learn to face challenges with grace, and ultimately, to face the inevitability of death with peace and acceptance. As you go forward in your own life, may you embrace the impermanence of life with an open heart, understanding that each moment is fleeting, yet rich with meaning. May you cultivate wisdom, compassion, and mindfulness in every action. And may the understanding of death empower you to live a life of greater peace, freedom, and joy. May you find liberation from the fears that hold you back, and may you walk the path toward true understanding, where both life and death are seen as part of the same beautiful journey. Thank you for joining me in this deep reflection. I wish all of you happiness, peace, and the strength to overcome suffering on your path to enlightenment.